Alright guys, in this video we're going to talk about the topic of growth. We've completed the foundations part of this class. We're really sort of transitioning from measurement to models. We're going to talk about growth, and that kind of is a measurement topic, and then we'll introduce our first model of the macro economy. What I want you to think when we're first here on this topic of growth, I just want to introduce this with a question that I always do when I teach this in class, which is, what year would you like to be born in? What year would you choose to be born in? I typically get answers. You go ahead and pause the video, think about what answer, maybe jot it down or whatever, what year you would answer here. I typically get answers, the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. I like the culture, I like the music, I like the whatever was going on during those time periods. All good answers, by the way. Definitely not things I necessarily disagree with. Occasionally I'll get answers that are like, go back to great historical time periods and find my own way. These are interesting. But the reason I ask that question is to set this up. What happens when I show you growth as we measure it in real GDP per capita around the world? Okay, so this bottom one here is the growth since the year 1000, right? And you can basically see from 1000 to 1800, essentially flat. That is the story of history, period, right? You go back another 1,000 years, you go back 5,000 years before that, that's it, right? I mean, the story of history is in the perspective of what we're looking at here. Real GDP, productivity, income, they're just almost zero. And then something happens, right? We start seeing this separation as we go into the 1800s. We get to around 1850s, 1860, when we really see the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution happens, and all of a sudden we see this undeniable growth in modern economies, right? So this is the U.S. here. We've got, it's kind of some interesting things. Let's just go through them one by one. The world average, right? So that doesn't look like much, sort of, because we compare that to U.S. and Australia and the United Kingdom, right? But the world average it shows a pretty impressive line of growth that really seems to be taking off, right? Western Europe, of course, I called that UK a minute ago because it's UK down here, but just the whole of Western Europe, extremely wealthy, right? It's a little interesting, right? Because we have some idiosyncrasies. Germany, for example. Where is Germany? The dark line is Asia. Latin America, we see some that are kind of down here by those sort of slower, lower, but still growing, sort of just taking off, if you will. And then, of course, we have Africa and what we would call developing parts of the world. The reason that I show that after asking this question is to say, does this change your answer, right? It might be really great to be born right here, or it might be really great to be born out here somewhere. Now, in class, everyone always protests. I think it's reasonable. Well, sure, but what if we have nuclear war between then and, the graph just immediately falls off? Reasonable thing to, I don't think there's a lot of reason to think that is going to happen. But there are systemic risks out there that people are genuinely concerned about. But the right answer might be to be born in 2200, right? Be born 100 or so years from now might be the best answer because of growth and all the things that come with that. This brings us to an idea we call the standard of living, right? This is the level of wealth, comfort, material goods, and necessities available to a certain socioeconomic class in a certain geographic area at a certain time. Standard of living has increased dramatically. Virtually no matter who you are, where you are in the world, by this point, by the time you're listening to this video, basically everyone's life is better off than if they were in the same socioeconomic class in the same geographic area in a previous time period. Okay, is that everything? No, obviously our lives are much more than just the material goods and necessities, wealth, and comfort that come with them, and it's a topic for a different time to discuss these very important things. But that doesn't mean that material well-being, comfort, wealth, etc. are nothing, right? It's definitely a factor, and this is one of the reasons that certain economists like Tyler Cowen make the very important argument that economic growth has a serious moral component, right? Because of how we've pulled people out of poverty, we've made people better off all around the world. We've made them healthier, we've helped them live longer, we've made them safer, all good things. Again, none of those things are the ultimate thing, but they're important things to be thinking about along the way. As an interesting aside, Andrew McAfee at MIT has a book called More from Less, and the basic point he makes there is we're actually producing more with fewer resources. So it used to be the case that if we wanted to produce more, the white line, then we had to extract more and more resources from the ground. And then there was a short time period where these two things sort of decoupled. We've already met the idea of decoupling. So this is decoupling not of wages and productivity, but decoupling of resources and production. They sort of decoupled. It went up, but the resource use also went up, but it just went up much slower. And McAfee has some interesting arguments. My grad students are actually reading this now while you're listening to this video, where it's actually resource use is flatlined or even slightly decreased, while production has continued to increase, right? So that standard of living is even coming at less and less expense because of our efficiency, which, by the way, in a microeconomics class, if I were to discuss this, I would point out that's because of the way that free markets drive us to cut costs. So those cost-cutting things that sometimes we don't like in different contexts, that's actually what allows us to use fewer resources. That's a part of cost-cutting, right? Okay. So economists then wanted to explain growth, these important ideas, standard of living and growth, GDP over time. How does an economy grow, right? And so early growth model came along and said, okay, well, we have this market theory. It's great. It stood the test of time. So an economy, a macro economy, essentially has three markets: the product market, the labor market, and the capital market. You can think of the capital market as the financial market. Remember what we said before, right? Capital market. We're going to use the word capital very precisely throughout this class. Okay, so let's take a look at each market. You've actually met the product market. This is supply and demand, price and quantity. You're very comfortable with this by this point in the class, so I'm not going to beat this one to death. What we've added here is this labor market, which we've actually seen before, and I want to sort of unpack that market. Okay, so the labor market has a supply and demand as well, right? But the supply curve is the households. They're providing hours in exchange for wages, just like we said when we did the circular flow model. Firms, on the other hand, are demanding hours and paying wages, right? So the same, product market, if the good in question is iPhones, right, then they're producing iPhones and receiving payment, and the people that are consuming the iPhones are giving the payments and receiving the iPhones, right? So there's that symmetry there. Okay. So what's the price in the labor market? It's wages, right? And what's the quantity in the labor market? That's hours. So we're going to denote that as QL or QH, right? Okay. So I'm saying, here's this supply of labor, here's this demand of labor. We get a market clearing wage. We end up with a certain amount of hours being worked. The other market is the capital market. Okay, so in this case, it's household firms providing savings and investment in exchange for interest, and on the other side, it's firms providing interest payments in exchange for savings that they can then turn into investment. Okay, what's the price in this market? That's the interest rate, right? So we think of prices pretty commonly, but a wage is a price, and an interest rate is a price. For example, there's a famous economist who wrote an article and said, it's actually Milton Friedman, we'll meet him more later in this class if you haven't heard that name before, made this argument, said, listen, increase in wages doesn't cause inflation. Wages are a price. The definition of inflation is an increase in the price level. So it's a bit tautological, but it's fundamentally right that wage increases aren't what's driving inflation. Something has to fundamentally be driving the price increases. One of those prices is wages. I also want you to think of interest rates as prices, because interest payments are the return to providing savings for a firm to have investment. Okay, so households, they have the capital in the financial sense, not the capital in the sense that we use it here, and they put make it available to the capital market. Firms then end up borrowing that. They pay this interest rate. Okay, so what's the price? It's the interest rate. What's the quantity? It's the level of savings and investment that match up. Okay, so the basic idea in the early growth model is you've got inputs and you've got outputs. You've got this aggregate output. Remember, we identified that as GDP, and it is directly related to an economy's technological level and quantity of input. Okay, this is what we call a production process. You take inputs, you subject them to the processes of production that you have given your level of technology, and you get this level of output. Okay, so one of the problems is you get this idea that's really common actually in Marxist literature, in communism, that says, well, see, the value of something is related to the labor that goes into it. Okay, but this is fundamentally wrong. It's actually quite easy to prove, right? My wife is an excellent baker, right? And so she goes, she makes a cake, right? And it takes her an hour, and it's beautiful. And I go and I put 2 hours into a cake, and it's terrible. Which one has higher value? Well, it's very obvious it's the first cake, despite the fact that we have twice as much labor in that cake, right? And the reason for this is actually quite straightforward, right? Value, remember, is subjective, and the new idea that we want to introduce, value is subjective and marginal. This is part of what was called the marginal revolution in economics. So a famous Austrian economist named Karl Menger brought this idea, and then subsequent economists, very important economists, have built on this idea. What gives something value? Well, it's the use of that particular thing to the individual based on how much they like it, which makes it subjective, right? You don't argue with people. You've ever met somebody that doesn't like chocolate? You know, it's just stunning because 90% of us, 99% of us love chocolate. You meet somebody that doesn't like chocolate, they say, chocolate, it's disgusting, right? Like, I won't eat it. It doesn't taste good. You know, it makes me feel sick, whatever. And every time I meet somebody like that, I was like a little taken aback because it's so universal that people love chocolate, right? Except that this highlights the importance of understanding that value is subjective. So I don't mean value is subjective as like moral relativism or something weird like that, right? What I'm saying is if there's somebody and they're selling chocolate, it's excellent, high-quality chocolate at a really good price, and you and I walk up to them, I might buy and you might not buy if you're a person who doesn't like chocolate. Okay, does that make you wrong? No, it's that value is subjective, right? And it doesn't matter how hard they worked on the chocolate. It doesn't matter, you know, their level of education and skill in producing chocolate, right? That might factor into your decision to purchase or not, but that's based on information, not on the actual fundamental value of the product, okay? So remember, labor theory of value, anytime you hear people saying odd stuff like, you know, the work that people are doing in a factory is really driving all of the value, and so therefore it's wage slavery and whatnot. You know, there are definitely certain problems, and in a different class at a different time we can get into some of the complexities of the way that the economy is structured, but this is a principles class. We want to really grasp that idea that labor theory of value does not do a good job explaining prices, wages. It's just fundamentally wrong in the way that we think about value. The other thing is the margin, just like I said, subjective and marginal. So why is it marginal? Okay, if I haven't eaten all day, right, and then I see somebody selling chocolate, and I'm pretty hungry, right, I love chocolate, I buy the chocolate. If you saw me the next day, and I walked by the same person, and I didn't buy the chocolate, fundamentally you probably wouldn't be confused, right? But if you were thinking in the context of this class, you might say, well, that's a little odd, isn't it? Didn't Lee love chocolate? He'd buy. Unbeknownst to you, right, I'd already had 6 chocolate bars this morning. I didn't buy a 7th. That's not weird at all, right? Because you fundamentally understand that the value of the chocolate bar is dependent on its marginal value too. How many have you had before? What other things have I eaten today? You know, what other things are factoring into my decision, okay? So subjective and marginal. Okay, so the growth theory, early growth theory comes along and says, okay, we're going to assume that wages paid to labor were directly related to the value that the labor produced. Okay, don't get confused. This is not the labor theory of value. this is that idea that we met before in this class, that labor is paid its marginal product. Labor is paid its marginal product. Okay, so let's dive into the labor market. It's got two things here: upward sloping supply, downward sloping demand. Anytime we get into a market like this, we want to think, why would demand slope upward? Downward. Why would supply slope upward? Okay, sometimes we take that for granted, right? It's like a truism we just learn. It's like demand goes down, supply goes up, but the question is why, right? Remember, all the way back in our market lecture, we learned exactly why supply goes up, and we learned exactly why demand slopes down. Okay, here, now we're in a labor market. There's slightly different answers, and the answer is marginal productivity. Okay, so as you hire more and more workers, their productivity ends up falling. Now, there's lots of reasons for this, right? It might be that you were hiring better workers, and then as you hire more and more people, the workers that remaining are not as talented, right? Not as hardworking, whatever skills are relevant to the job, right? But it's also because when you begin an operation, as you divide up the tasks and hire more and more people, it allows them to actually get better at those tasks. But eventually, as you hire more and more people, the task divisions become smaller and less impactful. Okay, so I'm running a restaurant. I hire one person. That person has to cook, and they have to serve as a waiter or a waitress, and they also have to clean up. They also have to bust the tables, right? So I hire a second person. Now I divide up the tasks. I say, okay, you cook and wait on the left half of the room, and this other person will wait on the right half of the room and will bust the tables. Well, they'll get better at doing those tasks compared to that first person, right? Okay, this is called division of labor. It's actually exactly what we saw in the absolute and comparative advantage lecture from earlier in this class. Okay, I hire a third person. This is probably the optimal scenario, right? Now I got one person cooking, one person waiting, and one person bussing. They all get relatively good at their tasks, right? It's specialization in trade, really, is what it is. And now they're able to really capitalize on these skills, get a lot better as they go. And so your marginal productivity will actually increase at first. But what happens when I hire a fourth person? Well, now there's no task, right? Maybe I need another cook. Maybe I need another waiter. But their productivity will be slightly lower, even if they're just as good skill and talent and effort-wise as the first three people I hired. What if I hire a fifth person, a sixth person? Now I've got two people doing each task. And of course you're saying to yourself, well, what if the size of the restaurant is increasing? But remember, we want to hold these other resources constant, right? So it's not useful to think about this as saying, okay, but what if the size of the restaurant doubles? I'm saying, given all these other things are fixed, the size of the restaurant, the capital, and the amount of people that come in the restaurant, what happens if I add more and more people? Okay, I add a seventh person, an eighth person, a ninth person. All of a sudden, that ninth person doesn't really have much to do. They won't be very productive. Okay, so this highlights this idea of marginal productivity falling. We call that diminishing returns. Okay, so because the productivity of future workers goes down, we see employers willing to hire them only at lower and lower prices, which is the wage. Okay, so the question is, why then is there upward sloping supply? Why do households require higher and higher wages in order to provide more and more hours? Well, that's because the supply curve represents a trade-off between consumption and leisure. The more you work, the less free time you have. If you don't have a job and you have all leisure, you have no consumption, right? And so this is for most people, this is a really bad situation. You don't want to have all leisure and no consumption, right? But neither do you want to work 100, what is the absolute maximum? You don't want to be working 150 hours or whatever a week, have all this consumption and no leisure time. Right, and so there's this trade-off. As I move from working 40 hours to 45 to 50, I'm going to have to be compensated more in order to provide that 5th, that 10th, that 15th hour of overtime. That actually is why we have overtime, right? In order for you to encourage me to provide those extra hours, you're going to have to pay me more to do it because you're cutting into leisure that is more and more valuable on the margin. Okay, so let's look a little bit at how the market works, right? Now that we kind of understand these things. Remember, it's real wages that we put up there, which means it's purchasing power, i.e. households are not fooled by inflation, right? So there's not inflation tricking us into using nominal wages. We're using real wages because we're correctly adjusting for prices. Okay, so we've got some assumptions here. One, there's going to be no unemployment because the labor market is always going to clear, right? The wage can move around, and so the labor market is going to end up clearing. Okay, so we learned a few things here about the labor market. Let's turn and look at the capital market. So when economists first started making these models, they ignored savings. There's actually a famous saying in economics, supply creates its own demand. That's from economist Jean-Baptiste Say. And the idea was, well, if we've got this labor market and we've got this product market and we go and produce things, well, then they must be bought up, and that's going to directly create the right amount of more new jobs or higher hours worked. So if you create something, then it has to be consumed. Okay. Of course, we think of that as somewhat silly, right? And that's in part because we understand that you have to have a capital market, right? So what happens without a capital market? Well, all earnings must immediately be spent, right? Because the capital market is where the savings go, okay? That means savings is the answer to sort of the paradox of Say's law, right? If workers instantly spend all of their earnings, then there has to be full employment, right? Because everybody who's working is spending, it's translating into products, which is translating into things for people to produce, right? There's no slack in that system, okay? So savings really is the capital market, right? So a couple quick things here, just as we were saying before. I'll go through it a little quicker here since we're comfortable with this idea now. We want to think about what the price is in the market. In the capital market, that's the interest rate, right? And we want to be thinking about the supply and the demand curve, right? So supply curve is how much is saved by households that's available for loans. Why is supply upward sloping? Because you have to give me a higher interest rate in order to get me to save more, because there are things that I have to forego consuming if I save my money. Why is demand downward sloping? Because they're wanting to invest in things, and the price that they pay in order to be able to invest in their firm is the interest that they pay into the financial market. The higher that is, the higher the standard for them to go through and get that money for investment. Okay, this presents this sort of air quotes problem of savings, right? What happens if consumer spending falls short? So then that means savings has to increase. Consumer spending had to go somewhere, right? Which will drive the interest rate down. More on that in a second. As a consequence, the level of investment will rise, right? Straightforward market. Again, we'll see this just one second. I just want to walk us through it. As a consequence, there's this increase in investment demanded. There will be an increased demand in the product market. So what we're saying is when firms go to invest, they've got to purchase the things that they're investing in, the capital, the physical capital, out of the product market. As a consequence, the product market will then have an increase in the amount that needs to be produced. So full employment will remain because we'll have sort of this extra loop in there that makes sure it happens. Okay, let's see it now. So you got the goods and service market. Consumer demand falls for whatever reason. So that's this here, right? So we're going to see prices going to fall, quantities going to fall, right? And looks like unemployment, right? But that means savings will increase. That's here, right? Savings increase, that'll see investment increase. That's this increase here, right? Because we were clearing the market at this interest rate and this level of savings. As the supply of savings from the households in the capital market increases, the interest rate falls, which causes the level of investment to go up, right? So why did savings go up? Savings went up because what happened over here in the goods market had to translate into an increase in supply of savings. Why did investment go up? Well, because the price, the interest rate went down, and so those that are consuming the investment, firms, are wanting more at this new, more favorable price, and so they increase the amount of investment. Okay, so savings goes up, right? The interest rate, the price goes down, the investment goes up, and we'll see a return in the demand curve, in the product market, because now the firms are picking that up in terms of investment. This will be a critique that we'll actually keep when we get to the Keynesian market, which will is our next model. More on that later. Okay, so our conclusion then of this market is if we have flexible wages, which is really the important thing. Why do these markets clear? These markets clear because prices are allowed to move around fully. Remember, that's an assumption at every stage that we've got here. Okay, if we've got flexible prices, one of the prices is wages, one of the prices is interest rate, one is prices in goods and services market, the outcome must be full employment. Okay, so if we've got flexible wages, we've got flexible interest rates, we've got flexible prices, things move around freely, we'll have full employment. Okay, so there's no space in a market for us to produce, in the early growth model, because it's based on markets that are freely moving, there's no space for the economy to grow by recruiting more resources because we have full employment. Okay? Consequently, there's only one way to get growth, and that's with technological or productivity improvements. Okay? This brings us to one of the most important lessons in the class. Productivity is key. It is what drives wealth. Productivity is the key to growth, is the key to wealth. Okay, this is one of the most important things we can learn. You're saying, okay, well, the model is a little bit unrealistic, make some assumptions. Yes, we're going to go through in models later on, and we're going to relax some of those assumptions. We're going to develop different models, and we're going to deal with some of those issues, but it doesn't take away from this fundamental point, right, which is this appropriately models the economy at some level, and this lesson that productivity is the ultimate key to wealth and prosperity and growth won't go away in any of our future models. In fact, the modern model that we'll use later on is going to be based on this same idea. Okay, so what's the takeaway here? Anytime you see policies, right, you see something in the news, you see a government policy being promoted, how should you evaluate it? You should evaluate it for whether or not this increases productivity. Whether or not this increases productivity. Okay, so if it doesn't increase productivity, it will not fundamentally improve wealth or growth. And so from that perspective, remembering the discussion we had at the beginning of this lecture, that growth is also probably a moral imperative based on the good that it does for all the people that it impacts, that is a primary way we should evaluate policies. Okay, so now let's turn our attention to long-run growth, right? Long-run growth. What are ways to improve growth in the long run? Another way to say, how do you see productivity increases in order to increase growth? There's a couple ways to do that, right? One is increasing the capital to labor ratio. So if you have workers and they're at full employment, they're doing the best that they can, how can we make them more productive? Increasing the amount of capital that they have on hand, improving the tools, giving them more tools, giving them just better resources for taking the inputs and making them into outputs. Okay, classic technological increases would be things like the internet, computing, right? You go back far enough, you got some really simple changes, like I say simple, but like wheels, engines, fire, or whatever it is that you want to put in those groups. Those are increasing capital to labor ratio. Okay. The next is a growth in the labor force, right? So if we have full employment, but the size of the labor force, say we get some immigration, that can actually increase growth because of full employment on a bigger labor force has more resources. Next is an increase in quality of labor. This is really just a subset of this one, right? Human capital, education, skill, experience, as those go up on average in your labor force, you'll have more productivity, you'll have more growth. And then, of course, just sort of broadly, again, these could kind of be put into subset of number one, increase in technology, improvements to your capital. Okay, so last question for this lecture. Why are some nations rich and some poor? Like when you're talking about growth, like this is the fundamental question that happens. And the answer is, the question is, why do we see development in some places and not in others? The answer is, in short, they're institutions. We've got 5 such institutions. And when I say institutions in this case, right, I mean particular arrangements in society. Like sometimes we think institutions, we think of like universities. But institutions here, I mean like social institutions. Okay, the first is protection of property rights. This is probably the most important thing. Property rights. Of course, the sort of twin sister of that is enforcement of contracts, right? So you have got to live in a society that has an effective way to protect people's property rights and protect their contract agreements. You know, if I make a deal with you, I have to hold up my end of the bargain. If you've got those two things, you're a long way towards seeing growth and development. Okay, next is economic freedom. This is well studied, obviously, in the field, right? If the places that have lower economic freedom have lower economic growth, and it's especially important that as we see changes in this, we see rapid accelerations, right? So China is extremely economically unfree. It becomes just a little bit more economically free, and we see good growth. Okay, on average, are they economically free? No, but a little bit of improvement there has improved their growth quite a lot. Next is a stable financial system, right? You need to know if you put your money in the bank, it's going to be there tomorrow when you show up. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to engage in productive activities. Should also, in theory, be able to provide you with a lot of flexible ways to deal with problems in your business or in your economy. And then last is public capital, and it really is last and least, but it is an important factor. Things like roads, bridges, power plants, etc., are all things that have their place in helping developing nations. I might argue this is a little bit more of a product of development rather than a driver of development, but I think it's pretty straightforward to see. Even like historical cases are really interesting, right? What's one of the things that Rome did when it was expanding its empire? It built a lot of roads that led to a lot of development in those local areas. So public infrastructure, public capital, another factor.